I think lefties need to come to a realization that you are not going to get what you want out of the Democratic Party. And when I say what you want, and when I mean lefties, I can call it the new left. I just mean people who pure think of policy. Medicare for all. I don't like this notion of progressive. I don't like that. Very specific. Medicare for all, expansion of Social Security, elimination of student debt, increase in minimum wage, Green New Deal, increase wealth tax, and radical transformation of our electoral system to make it more transparent and to make it without massive investments of cash. Those are my policy priorities. Yes, I would prefer to go further. I would prefer to have workers on the board of those companies. I would prefer to have public ownership of various companies. I would prefer to have either public or worker co-ops. I would prefer to have a jobs program that would go through and do labor, let's say like solar panels on everyone's houses, so you can cut down on the electricity bills and basically eliminate them from the grid, where if they need to use the grid, fair enough, but ultimately the houses would be providing their own power. Public transport. Yes, I would have a list of items that I would like to get across, but in order to get the majority of the public on my side with this stuff, I just choose policies that I think the majority of the public are on board for, at the very least from the standpoint of polling. These are the policies. I call it the people's agenda. Now, the Democratic Party is not for those policies. And even during a pandemic where you would think that this would be the moment where they can show who they are, they show who they are. But it's not this lefty stuff. Basically, Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic Party were able to pass the $3 trillion bill along basically party lines. You had lefties, some lefties who balked at this. Jay Paul probably being the loudest, who was extremely against this bill because it didn't necessarily contain progressive priorities. And again, those progressive priorities would have been the things that would have alleviated many of the hard, rough edges of what is taking place currently. Meaning, if you want to get cash into people's hands, if you want to make sure people can go to the hospital and incentivize those people to go to the hospital if they think they need to go without being afraid of getting a bill, well, Medicare for All is one of those things that does that. If you want to have a situation where people have more money in their pocket where you keep them off the unemployment, well, passing an employment guarantee, meaning allowing those companies to pay those people wages to keep them on the jobs, well, that would do that. I guess I'm making the point that many of the progressive priorities that they wanted to accomplish were specific to trying to deal with the crisis itself. This bill, however, that I've said going back almost the moment that this came out and the items that were going to be in this bill, it was only a showpiece. 4 bills were passed from the standpoint of the Republican Party that the Democrats went lockstep with. Those bills did not deal with the hard edges of what we are dealing with right now, meaning all of these people out of a job, all of these people not having resources, many of them not having health care during the middle of a pandemic. I'm trying to make the point that this is the time where you need to provide for the general welfare, and pussyfooting around it is not the way to go about it. They kept saying this is going to be Rooseveltian. This is not a Rooseveltian plan. There are even proponents or parts of this plan where basically are giving bailout to lobbyists. And understand, lobbyists spend their every waking moment trying to find ways to basically work for their corporate overlords. The poor doesn't typically have money to pay the lobbyists. Otherwise, they wouldn't be poor. I'm making the point that these guys spend their every waking hour trying to find ways to fuck over the public in the best interests of the people who are paying them. And the Democratic Party is basically spending time bailing these guys out. They also take the opportunity to basically bail out health insurance companies. Instead of providing Medicare or Medicare for all, something that has like 2 or 3% overhead, they want to give a bunch of money to insurance companies via COBRA. Again, it's more expensive, less efficient, and yet this is what the Democratic Party is. This is Business Insider. Spanning 1,815 pages, the $3 trillion bailout package is not poised to become law. Instead, its passage was meant for Democrats to demonstrate their priorities and signal what they will fight for in the later bipartisan bill that could pass in June. Business Insider's Kimberly Leonard reports. This was never meant to pass. This was only going to be a showpiece. And even in the context of it being a showpiece, making the point that this is what the Democratic Party stands for. Bailing out lobbyists, bailing out insurance companies instead of expanding Medicare for all, and basically telling lefties, go fuck yourself. Welcome to the soapbox. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support PayPal, Patreon. One of the things that must be understood is that basically Nancy Pelosi had an iron grip on writing this. She basically wrote this bill with her committee chairs basically by themselves. Many of the other Congress members were in their own areas, and so Nancy Pelosi had basically iron control over what went into this bill and what was kept out of this bill. And so if you're going to make the point that this bill is basically showing Democratic priorities, those priorities is basically telling lefties to go fuck themselves, because one progressive priority after the other was held out of this bill. Let's see what's in it. The final bill includes $1 trillion in relief and aid to states and localities, extends unemployment benefit enhancements to the end of January, and provides another one-time $1,200 stimulus payment to every American. The package also includes legislation to stop overcharging prisoners for phone and internet, as well as extending food stamp funding and protecting the post office. Again, this also goes into this notion of COBRA payments, which is basically giveaways to health insurance companies, and bailouts to lobbyists. And again, lobbyists spend their every waking moment trying to find ways to squeeze a buck for their corporation at the expense of us. And the Democratic Party, who's putting this out as a showpiece. What do you represent? We represent this. I'm glad you admit it. Here's the catch of what's not in the bill, because I think what's not in the bill is more interesting, which is why I say this is basically telling lefties to go fuck yourself. Basically, Nancy Pelosi had an iron grip of what went into the bill. She put in some items that basically a grab bag, but explicitly, despite the fact this was just a showpiece, explicitly left out progressive priorities. No lefty in Congress should have voted for this bill. And when you look around and why are we so marginalized? Why don't they back us up? Why don't they accept our policy agenda? They don't have to. Because at the end of the day, you could be maligned in such a way, trashed in such a way, where even in a bill that has no chance of passing, they still don't want to put your stuff in the bill because they don't want people to think that that's what they represent. Understand, they were literally willing to crash and burn to Donald Trump, somebody who they call the walking apocalypse, if it meant stopping Sanders and his policy priorities or our policy priorities. So you need to understand how that Democratic Party is organized and how the party is arranged. What you want out of the political system, you're not going to get. The political system is fundamentally broken. You are not going to get what you want just doing basic and regular politics where you try to push this guy, push that guy. That hasn't worked for 40 years. It's not going to work this time around. There is no magical door to this process. You've gotten so far along in regards to the right that the best that you can get for the Democratic Party is this bill in the middle of a pandemic that rivals the Great Depression. What was not in the bill? What was not in the bill? Let's see. No recurring cash payments, no to guaranteed paychecks that would keep workers off unemployment, despite the proposal getting broad support from the caucus. No to Medicare paying for the healthcare costs of the unemployed, no to jobs guarantee, no to a moratorium on rent and mortgage payments, no to student and debt forgiveness, no to public ownership stake in companies that are bailed out. Understand, that's actually a big one. If we in this government say we're going to give you cash, we're going to give you money, we're going to give you millions of dollars, and you take that money, well, we should get a reorganization and a redo. For the most part, people who were rich were able to just pass that money down the line. People who were poor had to basically struggle from point A to point B, but the people who were rich could basically accrue more and more cash just because cash accumulates cash, providing you're not doing some stupid. Cash basically accumulates cash. You don't have to really do anything till it just grows. Well, if cash just grows in that way, And you have people who can buy companies, who can buy stocks, who can buy all of these things. Well, they start off with a certain advantage just based on birth and dumb luck. Well, in this situation where these companies always say, we built it, we earned it, we did this, we did that, the moment that government, the public, has to give you cash in order to keep your business afloat because your business hit the skids, it is perfectly legit for that government to put concessions on that cash or to ask for concessions for that cash. And putting your workers on the boards of those companies is one of those concessions that seems to just be right in line with what should be done and what should be in the interest of the public. If you're trying to find ways to increase wages, if you're trying to cut down on companies being shipped overseas, how do you do that if you don't have those workers having an actual stake in the votes of those companies? Fact of the matter is, if you had employees running those companies as opposed to having CEOs running those companies, they will be less inclined to ship themselves overseas, but they will also be inclined to pay higher wages. You bringing in a CEO is kind of like this notion of the old time of kings and queens, where people thought these guys were appointed by God and they were utterly and entirely necessary. Britain fought a war against the king, beat the king, and still said, well, clearly he's appointed by God and he's necessary. I'm making a point to you that your CEOs are also just as worthless. The employees themselves can run those companies. They have all the capacity, the agency, and everything else to run those companies. That wealth wouldn't be expropriated to the top. You wouldn't be having somebody walking around calling themselves a trillionaire by 2026. Your environment, your economic system would be fundamentally different. And I would argue better. I would argue it would be better. But in that very specific case, that's not going to be part of it. No prohibition against corporate mergers or greater protection against private equity predators picking off the bones of the weaker companies. Now, understand why that's an issue and why that should have been included. Within 4 months, over 60% of the companies of retail out of business. Meaning many of the companies that have been able to go from point A to point B because they are not bringing in income, because basically they have to pay rent, they have to pay all of this other thing for inventory. Well, if they're not making cash, they can't stay afloat. And the longer this goes, the less likely they'll be able to make it. Now, the catch here is if you have larger companies that are able to survive the pandemic, they can scoop in and buy up the other smaller companies. So the point is to basically have protections for these companies to try to prevent these type of predatory behaviors, basically vulture capitalism, where they're picking up the bones of these companies. No major green infrastructure initiative. Basically, Jayapal looked at this in the way that she should have looked at this. This is a crisis. We need to attack this crisis in real, legitimate terms where people can see what we represent and what we stand for. That's what the lefties wanted. Nancy Pelosi didn't want that. And this bill, in getting across the meager Democratic priorities, definitely gets across that one of those priorities is not what lefties want. You should not back a party that is not going to represent your interests. And in a situation where we have literally a pandemic, my wife was talking about how surreal it is to walk outside and everybody's wearing these masks and whatnot. You still can't get this party to function in the best interests of the public as opposed to functioning in the best interests of their donors. And by the way, the Democratic Party got a ton of cash from lobby group PAC. They donated $191 million to the current members of Congress. You're not going to get what you want out this party. And the more you vote for it, the worse they get. Understand, the moment that you lose accountability in your political process, you want to know why these guys are so feckless and weak in regards to getting things accomplished? It's because we continuously voted them in that office, not because of who they were in an affirmative argument, but because of who they weren't. They weren't Republicans. They had the D beside their name, so you put them in office. Missing the point that that person still is going to be doing something in that office. And just because you gave that guy a pass, because you were terrified of the Republican, you've allowed one iteration after the next of a weak, feckless, spineless Democrat to get into that office. And when you actually need them to do something, this is the shit you get. And they call that Rooseveltian. It's astonishing. Lefty priorities were left out of that intentionally. That's the part that I'm trying to nail down. They put this bill up as a showpiece in order to show these are our priorities. It wasn't meant to pass. It was just to say, this is what we represent. What wasn't in it was the stuff that lefties wanted. And again, the stuff that would have been more ideal to dealing with the hard edges of our predicament. Your Democratic Party, ladies and gentlemen, the more you vote for it, the weaker it's going to get. Yeah, I'll leave it here. I don't want to sound like, be repetitive about it. But every time you go and you just back any random blue, you do two things. You cut down the vote total because people get sick of these kind of lily-livered Democrats not necessarily doing anything to deal with their real material concerns. But you also basically put somebody in that office who is ineffective in actually getting policy that you want to accomplish. You've been basically backing people who in no way back you. How on earth are you going to get your policy agenda accomplished in a party that in no way backs your policy agenda? And if you were curious about whether they did or not, the bill is right there. You can look at it for yourself. Yes, there's some good things in the bill in regards to testing and those type of things and giving money to the states in order to prop the states up. But bailing out lobbyists? That's gross. And not just bailing out lobbyists, dumping all of that money to insurance companies as opposed to expanding Medicare for all, something that, again, has 88% support among Democrats. This is your Democratic Party. Like, share,